Good morning, everyone. We are going to talk about advocacy today. It's a hot topic right now. And probably the most important thing to know about advocacy is really kind of defining our role when it comes to advocacy, but also defining the word advocacy is important because we have so many people kind of with this idea that we're meant to be doing or being something that we're not, that's not really in our scope of practice, not really within our role. And so that's what we kind of decided to create this little class session for, so we can clarify all that. And I speak to the other heads of the other organizations quite often, and Debbie Young, who heads up or has been heading up ICEA, and she also is one of our contacts, our main contact over at Enjoy, that we use Enjoy a lot. You guys know that. She and I were discussing like the legalities of a lot of things when it comes to advocacy, and just how important it is to make sure that as doulas, we're not stepping outside of our scope and our role in order to, do our job. And so in that, we've got to clarify exactly what it's all about. So let me share my screen so you can see our agenda-ish for today. The first thing I want to go over is really just defining what is advocacy. So if you look up advocacy in the dictionary, you're going to see that it means like to support, to speak out in favor of. What it doesn't say is that you're an ambassador. So the difference being, if you're an advocate for something, you can be an advocate for natural birth, you can be an advocate for home birth, you can be an advocate for epidurals, it doesn't matter. You can speak out and speak up in favor of those things. What it does not mean is that you are the voice piece of a decision maker. Okay, so an ambassador would be representing or stepping into the position of the person, right? Or of the country, if you're talking about like political ambassadors. That is not what doulas do. And so let me explain that outside of the birthing room, we can definitely be advocates in that sense of the word. Okay, so when we're protesting things, or we're at a rally all for protecting midwifery rights, or whatever it is that you are an advocate in favor of, you can definitely be a voice and be a face in those movements. The difference comes when you enter into a hospital setting. And so when we're talking about a hospital setting, you are no longer a voice for that ideal or that principle, right? In a hospital setting, your role as doula is to support that person. Now, in a hospital setting also, the word advocate takes on a different meaning, in that you are not the voice piece. You cannot be the voice piece unless you are a legal medical advocate with papers to show that you are the quote unquote proxy of your client. You can't really speak for them. Let's look at it from the other side of things. If you're the doctor or the nurse, and you were to say to them, hey, give her this medication, hey, do or do not do this procedure, and they listened to you, the client could sue them because you don't have the right legally to consent to medications, procedures, or not consent for that matter to medications, procedures, etc. So it's really important that we understand, what can we do? Because if we can't speak up for someone when they're in labor, what is our role? Like, how can we help them? Because obviously, if any of you have ever given birth, you know that when you're in labor, you're kind of, if you're doing a great job of coping with your contractions. You might be in la la land and you don't want to be pulled back into reality in order to advocate for yourself, right? But at the same time, you can't rely on someone else to speak for you except one person. And that one person legally in a hospital is your partner or the baby's daddy or your legal partner. That is the one person who can speak for you legally within a medical setting. So let's go back to our little outline here. The next thing is, what do people think advocacy is? So one of the tricky things when it comes to doula work is defining our role and our scope. And as far as the main doula organizations that exist, that we've been around, you know, Maternity Wise has been around 20 plus years. DONA's been around as long, Kappa's been around as long. Alice, which is now 2 Labor, has been around the longest. We all agree on one thing, and that is that we cannot be an ambassador or speak for or be the voice of clients in labor. But what we can do, obviously, is be someone who raises the volume. So what does that look like? So people think advocacy means, you know, there's some trainers out there that teach doulas, you don't speak for the client, you don't, you know, even, you know, you're not even part of the conversation, you're nothing, you're faceless, you're just there to massage their back. I've even had trainers who not our trainers, but I know of trainers who have taught their doulas that when the doctor walks in, the doula walks out. And so in that way, you are not at all a part of the conversation. You are not at all facilitating communication. And that's the key little phrase there. But you're not participating in that whatsoever, right? That is not right. That is what I call the med-loyalist, right? So if you are a conventional medical loyalist, you're going to say, we never disagree with a doctor. We never give any other options. We are here to be a part of the compliance team, right? And that is definitely not our role. That is the antithesis of our role, right? We are not here to just eliminate options or eliminate knowledge for our client and expect blind compliance. Our job is definitely to do more than that. The opposite end of the spectrum, however, is many good intentioned doulas think that their job is to be something like a bodyguard, right? So the bodyguard mindset would be, I'm the shield of this person. I am the force field of protection for this person. I am going to be the voice of this person because she's in the middle of a contraction, so she can't speak for herself, so I will speak for her. That is also incorrect. That's the opposite end of the spectrum, right? And that's also unbalanced because one is, you know, the extreme and this one's the extreme. Do you want to be something of a shield for your clients? Absolutely. Do you want to make sure that their voices are heard? Absolutely. There's ways to do that without stepping outside of your role. So what makes advocacy different in a medical setting? So like I said, legal implications for your client, right? For hospital staff, but also for you as the doula. So for your client, if you were to say yes or no to something for them or on their behalf, I've even had situations where I've had, you know, client is in rip roar in labor. She's in super active labor, really, really doing her best to focus. And the nurse is just peppering her with those registration questions, right? And they're just trying to get their job done. And so they're asking all these questions. I have been very careful because I want to just answer the questions for her because I know the answers, right? I know, is she on any vitamins? I know the answer to that because I've had these conversations with her. When was her last check? I know because I've had these conversations with her. But I can't say those answers for her, right? However, I can say, oh, I'm sorry, she's in the middle of a contraction. Can we just give her a second, right? Or another way that you can do it is you can turn to your client and you can say, your last check was on Friday, right? Right. And then the nurse overhears that, puts it in the computer, whatever. but you're helping to facilitate that communication without speaking for her, right? So always, always speaking to the client, that's perfectly fine. Speaking for the client to the providers, no. So like I said before, for the hospital staff, if you were to give them directives about your client's care or give them consent on behalf of your client, that could be a real problem for the hospital in the end, right? They can literally sue them because they did not get consent, because they're listening to somebody that is not the birthing person, right? And then also for you as the doula, you can get into trouble because the hospitals know what your role is. They know the limits of your role. And if you're stepping in and you're physically being a shield, there's a story that went around early on in Minnesota where somebody apparently had gotten in between a birthing mama's legs, and doctor was going to do an episiotomy, and she said, if you are going to cut her, you have to go through me. Well, what happened there was they got rid of her, got security to come take her away, the doula, and all the hospitals, word spread like wildfire, and all the hospitals in the area shut down their doors to doulas and said they just came up with all kinds of things. One of the things they said was, oh, doulas are a voodoo religion. They said, oh, doulas are, woo-woo, new agey, satanic, all these different crazy things. And we had to build back the relationship and the trust with these caregivers because one doula stepped out of her scope. And so for you as the doula, you're not just representing you and your scope of practice and your role, but you're actually representing all of maternity-wise. If you're a maternity-wise doula, you're representing everyone in your organization. If you're of a different organization, you're representing doulas of every stripe. And so when we step out of our scope and we start mouthing our, what we think is our clients' wishes, we risk the right for doulas to be in the birthing room at all because we're intervening in a way that's outside of our scope of practice. Now, can you be a legal voice for your client? Yes, but you need to have paperwork that says that you are legally have the right. And this is not something that you can just put on your contract and your client signs. This is a legal documentation. And I think Elizabeth Grossman, are you here today?
I am. Hi.
Hi. What is the document called where someone would give over their medical rights for someone else to say? Is that considered a proxy?
There's a healthcare proxy. There's a power of attorney. There are different things. I think there's a legal medical advocate. So I think, it's different in different states. I don't know that a doula would have the same healthcare proxy that like the partner would have. So I think it would look different, but I don't know too much more about that.
Okay, fair. So and Steph just said in the chat too, every state is different, which is true. So if you have legal, medical, we'll call it proxy or a power of attorney, if you have that kind of training and you have that kind of licensure or certification or whatever it is that you need in your state, and you have the document that says, I am able to make decisions for my client, that's a different story, but that is not the doula's role, right? And as a doula, you could go and get that if you wanted, right? You can go and get yourself certified and get that paperwork going and make yourself a legal representation for your client. And your client could agree to that and all that. But if you're not all the way in that way legally, then your role has to stay to your scope. And your scope allows for facilitating communication, right? Not speaking for. So also, we want to remember that your client chose to give birth in this location. For better or for worse, right? They may have felt like they had no other choice. They may have felt like, their insurance isn't going to cover anything else. They may have wanted a home birth, but they live in Nebraska, and so they can't have a home birth. You know, there's situations that might, and not to say that you don't have any choices at all. Nobody is a victim in this world. We all have choices to make, but you can't fault them, or you can't step outside your scope of practice, or try to expect the kind of care in a medical hospital setting that isn't offered there, right? So I've heard people say you can't go to McDonald's and order a prime rib, you know, or a filet mignon. You can't go someplace and expect them to give you something that is not on the menu, right? And in a hospital setting, a home birth type environment is not on the menu. And in many hospital settings, you know, laboring in water or birthing in water is not on the menu. In some hospital settings, VBAC is not on the menu. Twin vaginal birth might not be on the menu. So you can fight all you want with your client to get what they want, but at the end of the day, this is the place she's giving birth. This is the place that, whether she feels like she has options or not, this is the place she chose to give birth. And so we have to respect that, right? And we have to remember, if they can't give her what she wants, we can't speak up for her and say she wants this, or demand for something for our clients that they don't offer, right? That also is going to cause trouble for you as a doula. And then the other thing is, and it's tricky, because you're trying to facilitate communication while also potentially having to educate caregivers while you're doing it. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes you're dealing with actual ignorance when it comes to the physiology of birth. And you have to do that with grace and patience. You can't, in a hospital setting, and with most doctors, there is a huge wall of ego that is put up. And so for you to say, well, I know that, you know, delaying the cord clamping is the best thing for the baby, the doctors aren't going to agree with you, even though it's true. Doctors are not taught that, right? Doctors are taught to clamp and cut immediately, or within 30 to 60 seconds, or whatever the current protocol or recommendation is, right? And so having an argument with a doctor over what's right, over what your client wants, etc., it's not going to help you. It's not going to help your client. What you can do, obviously, as doulas, and I'm hoping you're doing this, is that you are working very hard to prepare them, working hard to help them know what their birthing location choices are going to, you know, what comes along with that. So like, if they're going to be in the hospital, here's the protocol at that hospital. Here's the protocol with this group for these things, right? For induction, for cord clamping is a big one. And I've had it happen where I'm there in the room and the practitioner says something just completely silly and ignorant. And two things I always say: when someone says something that is definitely wrong. So for example, you have a doctor who, and I had this happen once, she looked my client dead in the eye and said, if I don't clamp and cut this cord immediately, the baby's heart will pump all its blood back into the placenta and the baby will die. And she was dead serious about it. And the mom and I looked at each other and kind of laughed, because we both knew that was not true. And she said, well, regardless, I don't want you to clamp or cut the cord. And the doctor went ahead and did it anyway, because she was what? Ignorant, right? And I always say there's two types of people who say stuff that's wrong. Number one, either they're trying to manipulate you and intimidate you into just going along with whatever it is they're trying to do, or they're truly ignorant of the truth of that physiological process. And in my opinion, neither one of those is a safe caregiver, but there they are, right? So you've got a choice when you're faced with somebody like that, and neither one can you convince right? So no matter what, even if you're in the moment and you know they're saying something that's just straight up wrong, you can't stand there and educate a doctor in that moment. They're not going to hear you, and they're going to see it as fighting. They're going to see it as you want to fight with them. And so you don't want to bring confrontation into the birth. However, you can repeat back to your client what it is that she wants, right? And you can, so I have a little 3-step process that I do. I was talking about this yesterday in the racism class. What I do is I will, when my client has a choice to make, because as doulas, we are guardians of consent. We are not givers of consent. We don't take away consent. That's outside of our scope, right? That's what a lot of times people think advocacy is giving consent for the client. No, we're guardians of her consenting for herself, right? And so what I do is when a choice comes up, whether my client is aware that a choice is coming up or not, let's use episiotomy as an example. I see the doctor getting ready to do an episiotomy. They may have not even said a word to my client about the fact that they're about to do an episiotomy or breaking her water. Let's say breaking her water. I see the doctor with the amnio hook. They're getting ready to do a cervical exam. They're getting ready to break her water. They haven't said a word about it to my client. My client has not consented to this. So I'm going to turn to my client and I'm going to say, did you have something on your birth plan about breaking your water? And because I have already prepared my client ahead of time, that at some point I might ask you about something, that is your cue in to say yes or no. And legally, they have to say, no, I don't want the thing. And that is how you get a revocation of consent. So if you say, do you want your water broken? And the client says, no, that's not good enough. They actually have to call it by name. And so I prep my clients for this ahead of time. No, I don't want my water broken. And so I'm basically giving them the words to say, right? Okay. Now, if the doctor does not respect the revocation of consent that she just gave, or that she just did, then I'm watching, right? Because that's my job, is to be an eyeball and be, aware of what's going on in the room. And so I'm going to say to my client again, so you don't want your water broken. Did I understand that correctly? This is my second strike and you're out, right? So this is second strike. The client can then, and I say that in a louder voice, by the way. So I'm making sure that everybody in the room heard me. I'm not saying it in a mean voice, but I'm just saying it louder with a smile on, right? But so did I understand you correctly? You don't want your water broken, right? Is that right? And then she can say, that is correct, right? And this communication is very clear. For anyone in the room, they are clear on what my client wants or does not want. If the physician continues to just move toward doing the thing, whatever it is, water broken, episiotomy, whatever it is, I whip out my phone. And we were just talking about this last night, what the legalities are. And sorry for always calling on you, Elizabeth. But we were talking about, she's going to look into it, because we were talking about what are the legalities of recording. In a hospital setting, they don't want you to record, but we're trying to figure out what the rights of the persons are. So family can probably record and won't get kicked out. Doula, you probably will get kicked out, and that doesn't do your client any good. So you might not want to be recording. But what I do, I'm not recording, but I will pull out my phone and I say, okay, I'm just going to document that at 9:31 a.m., she said she didn't want her water broken. And I'm typing this into my phone, right? And when I say the word document and I say the time and I'm typing away on my phone, showing that I'm documenting that she refused having her water broken or whatever the thing is, I've only had to do this twice in my whole life. It worked both times. But that thread of accountability, that is advocacy. That's advocacy within our scope in a hospital setting. That is something we can do, is repeating what our client says. We're not speaking for her. We're just repeating what she already said, just to, make sure everybody heard her. If we need to repeat it twice, we repeat it twice, just to make sure everyone's very clear on what was just said, right? What was just approved or not approved. And then you can, use a little threat of accountability. Doctors who are used to getting their own way and bullying, they don't like that. Right?
And can I add to that real quick?
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So this actually just happened to 2 clients ago. And I was busy, my hands were busy, so I couldn't get my phone out and document. So I actually asked the spouse, hey, could you do me a favor and send me a text message of da 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 da? And so the spouse did, but it was loud enough to where the spouse could hear and the nurse could hear what was going on. So then they stopped what they were doing.
And one of the things I haven't ever had to do this, but one of the things I might follow up with that is, and I teach this, but is to, once you've done that, is to say to the nurse, do you mind just making sure that's in her file, on her medical record, that she refused that at this time? So we're going to get into narcissism on another day. We do a narcissism in maternal health settings. We do another free talk like this. But the reason why I bring that up is because this is why that works. So in a medical setting, most of the time, the person who's being the bully, or the person who's not respecting the bodily autonomy or respecting the consent of the client, of the patient, it's because they're maybe a narcissist, but they're at least, at minimum, using some narcissistic tactics to get their way, to go ahead and do what they want to do, whether or not you give them consent. And one of the worst things you could threaten a narcissist with is accountability, right? Is any kind of consequence for their behavior. And so this is why it works to say, I'm documenting this, because in a legal setting, so 2 things caregivers in a hospital are very afraid of. One is getting sued, and another is actually doing something wrong that causes a problem that there could be getting sued for, right? And so they're going to follow their rules, they're going to follow their protocols, but they're also going to do the things that they think are going to gain compliance. And one of the problems is that bullying is very effective at gaining compliance, especially if you're in labor and you're full of oxytocin, which I call the trust and obey chemical, right? Because oxytocin, it makes us willing to do anything that we're told to do for the betterment of our baby, right? And so if you're told, we got to do this, your baby's going to die, whether or not that's a big not true or not, doesn't matter. In the moment, when you're just thinking about your baby's safety, you're willing to do whatever you're told if you're convinced that what the practitioner is saying is true. So if there is a situation where there's actual birth ignorance, you can, if you want, if it seems appropriate, if you have time, you can state a statistic. You can say to your client, we know that's not true. So how do you feel about this moment? Like, what do you want to do at this point? Right. So I had another, a nurse one time say to my client, she had asked for a bite of granola bar from her mom, who was standing there eating a granola bar in triage in front of her. And she says to her mom, she says, I would love a bite of that granola bar. And the nurse spun around on her heels and said, you can't eat in labor or you'll die. And she was so dramatic about it. You guys have probably heard this story lots of times if you've been with Maternity Wise at all, because this is one of our difficult scenarios calls, examples that I typically will give. But the mom and I, the nurse was so dramatic about it that the mom and I were half unsure if she was serious or if she was joking or what was going on there. And we just busted out laughing because of the extreme, you know, take that she had on it. And she left the room, went and tattled on us to the doctor. The doctor came back. I had worked with that doctor many, many times. This nurse was new. And she said, Anne, we just all have to get along. And I was like, well, she told her if she has a bite of granola bar, she's going to die. And she was like, she said, what? So, you know, there's going to be opportunities where accountability is instant, right? And they removed her from my client's care. We never saw her again that day. So there may be times when you can, you know, call in somebody above them. There may be times that you have somebody come in and, you know, they do this, it's called the bandwagoning technique, where if you don't want to do something, you say no to something, they're going to bring in another person, right? They might bring in a resident. They might bring in the head of OB that's there on the floor. They might bring in another nurse, whatever it is, but they're getting their numbers because they know that with numbers, they're more likely to be able to coerce your client. But if it's based on something that is just physiologically not true, you can stand your ground with your client and you can reassure your client that's not how this works, physiologically speaking, and you don't have to accept that. You don't have to consent to that procedure. And you can feel free to say that in front of your client, or I mean in front of the caregivers, but you better darn well be right. Okay? Because if you're not right, if you're saying something and it's not 100% correct, that's going to reflect badly on you. It may make you look like you are interfering with care. And that is another thing that will get you removed by security. And that doesn't help your client at all. So, all right. So if you're in the room, something comes up, it's based on ignorance, don't fight. Just think to yourself, well, this person they're either being manipulative. Let's call it what it is. They're either being a bully and they're being manipulative because they know it's not true. Or if they're truly ignorant, just recognizing that they didn't wake up today trying to ruin this person's birth, but they obviously were not educated properly on whatever it is that we're talking about, whatever the excuse they gave. All right, so let's move on. Why is advocacy for doulas all about consent? Let's talk about ensuring consent. So ensuring consent, or making sure that consent is possible, only happens if the person has been prepared before the big day. You've probably heard the saying that if I don't know all my choices, then I don't have any choices, right? If I don't know all the information, how can I give consent that is informed consent? It's not possible. Informed consent means you have all the information and you are making a decision based on all the information. With Maternity Wise, we teach something called BRAINS, and that stands for B stands for benefits, R stands for risks, A stands for alternatives, like, are there any other options? Can we do something different to get to the same goal, right? I stands for intuition. What's your gut telling you? I don't care what kind of scientific marvels and research that we have out there. Nobody knows your body like you do. And so if your client says, I don't want to do that. I don't feel good about that. We have to listen to her. Her intuition far exceeds any protocol, anything. So if she doesn't feel good about it, that's it. No more needed to know. The N stands for what if we don't do anything now, or not now, or nothing, right? But we're not, again, remember, we're facing big egos in a hospital setting. And so you don't ever want to just say a flat no. It's always a not now. Because who knows, in the 3 hours later, she might be like, yes, let's do that, right? So you're never going to say no, never. right? It's just a not now. And oftentimes that's all they need to hear to check the box, and they leave you alone, right? And then the S, because we teach brains with an S, S just stands for space. The space, the time, the take the pressure off so that they can make a decision. All right. So if you are, if you're spending your time wisely with your clients ahead of time, you are preparing them, you're teaching them about their options, you're helping them to understand what are the benefits, the risks, the alternatives. In the moment is not the time to be educating your client about the brains of the situation, right? That you don't have time. If you have a provider who's standing over your client or standing behind you and you're not able to, spend the time and get into the nitty gritty of why something might be good, bad, or otherwise, or what the alternatives might be. In that moment, your job is to remind them about what you've already taught them. Okay. And if any additional information is needed for them to make that choice, like in the moment, maybe when you went over water breaking in the past, you didn't know her group B strep status at the time. So now maybe she's group B strep positive. There might be more things to consider in a situation where maybe water being broken, she needs to consent to or not. So there may be additional information, but in the moment is not the time to be breaking it all down and educating your client. That's the time to be reminding them, right? Now, guarding consent is the next thing that doulas are meant to do. And that is asking for consent when no one else does. And this is where I'm talking the example I gave you of like doctor's got an amnio hook in hand and hasn't said a word to your client about breaking her water, right? I've seen it happen too many times where they're doing a cervical exam. And as they're doing the cervical exam, doctor says, okay, well, I'm just going to break your water real quick. Wait, that's not consent, right? Implied consent means that when you walk in the hospital and you've signed a little paper saying, I agree that you can do what you need to do to me to keep me safe, to, do what you believe is the best for me. Unless you say, no, I don't want that thing, implied consent is still at play. And that's why I was explaining you need to be able to refuse it in the moment, right? But still, we're not, as doulas, we don't operate on implied consent. As doulas, we need to be operating on informed consent, right? We need to be operating on, in the moment, mama, do you want to do this or not? Because you might have had one idea a couple days ago and you have the freedom, or even an hour ago, you have the freedom to change your mind at any time. But consent needs to happen in the moment. And so guarding for consent means that when something's about to happen, you as doulas, because you've seen it before, you know what to look for. This is part of your job, is to be an eagle eye about what's going on in the room, is for you to make sure that someone has gotten her consent before they do whatever it is they're doing. And that might just even mean, your doctor, you went to your doctor's office and after you're getting ready to leave and the woman at the front desk says, okay, well, your induction's set for Sunday at 5 a.m. And your client, has she agreed to that? Right? And so in the moment, she can say, well, I'm going to go home and talk about that with my partner. But guarding consent means you'll have this conversation with her and she can call them back and say, no, thank you. I'm not going to be going in for the induction. Right. And for whatever reason, and I was one of them, but for whatever reason, a lot of times women have a really hard time standing up to their caregivers. And we talked a little bit about this last night, but walking into a hospital situation, they do not have legal right to you just because you walked into their building. You know, they can ask you to do anything or say anything or agree to anything. That doesn't mean that you have to. A lot of times in a hospital setting, they really have this authoritative mindset that they're the boss over the patient, and that's not true. But because they're walking and talking like that, a lot of times the patient doesn't know that they don't have to comply, right? But this is where, in the moment, you're helping your client to make sure that they're actually making decisions about their own care and helping them have the words and helping them have the bravery to say whatever it is that they're needing to say. Now, I've had clients who I do this and I say, okay, well, I remember we had a conversation and you have opinions about whether or not you want your water broken or whatever it is that comes up. And the client will sheepishly say, well, if Dr. So-and-so wants me to or thinks that I should, then I guess it's okay. And how do you react? You're not speaking for her, obviously, but how do you react? You let her know, well, she gets to make the decision. It's not up to them. And they can give recommendations, but what do you want to do? I've had clients who turn to me in the middle of labor and they say, well, what should I do, Anne? And I have to turn it right back on them and say, it's not my body. It's not my baby. It's not my birth. What do you want to do? How do you feel? And it's okay to say no. And I'll tell them that it's okay to say no. Because sometimes, and depending on what kind of background they're coming from, sometimes they need to hear that, right? A lot of women come from backgrounds of abuse, manipulation, coercion, and it's triggering. It's triggering for them to be able to say no. But we still have to guard their voice, raise their voice, and not be it for them. So then the third thing is documenting consent. So like we said before, making it clear when consent has been given or not. And so if someone has not given consent, being able to say, I'm documenting this. Say the time, say whatever it is that she's refusing. And that documentation, this is how doulas are advocates, right? It's all about guarding consent, ensuring consent, documenting consent. Now, navigating the raise your voice concept, right? So I gave you some examples. You don't have to necessarily raise your volume, although I do. I don't raise it I watch my tone, and I don't raise it in a yelling kind of way or anything like that. But I'm going to raise my volume, and I might turn my head toward the caregiver or whatever as I'm saying it. And if I feel like the caregiver is being a jerk, being a bully, I will make eye contact with the caregiver. And I'm not being a snot when I do it, but I'm gonna hold my attitude. I'm gonna have a pleasant look on my face, right? And I'm gonna say, you're not wanting your water broken. Is that correct? That's what I heard you say. And I'm gonna look in the eyes of the caregiver. So doulas, we have to be brave because that's not easy to do in the moment. Scripting and timing. So if it helps you to write little scripts in your brain of how to do this, go for it, right? But the timing is really important. You don't want to interrupt a conversation. You don't want to interrupt a doctor if they're saying, oh, we need to do this and this is what we got to do. And, the baby's going to die if we don't do it. Let them finish. I used to joke with Rachel because Rachel, when she first started, you guys know Rachel West, she's our Facebook manager. She used to have a really hard time guarding her face. So we'd be in a birth together and the doctor would say something that was just erroneous and she would roll her eyes and she'd look at me and she'd be like, oh, can you believe this guy? You know, so you have to be really careful that you're not giving off disrespectful vibes here or facial expressions, right? That could be um, considered disrespectful, but at the same time, you can look at your client and give them that look like, not sure that's true, or that's not what we asked, or whatever, right? Another thing that I do that kind of helps me with the timing, and you guys can use this technique if you want, but I call it pick a corner. So I'll look at a corner. I might be massaging her feet, but I'll pick a spot on the wall, or I'll pick a corner of the wall, and I won't make eye contact with them. And I explain this to them ahead of time, that if I'm not making eye contact with you and shaking my head like, yes, what they're saying is true, yes, you know, yes, this goes along with what you said on your birth plan. If I'm not giving them any kind of positive feedback and I'm just like staying on that spot and I keep my face neutral, some of y'all might need to look in the mirror and practice this, because some of us have resting bitch face in a hard way, right? So just be careful, watch your face. But my timing is I will not make eye contact with my client while they're having their own discussion. I'm not going to interrupt the discussion. She might be asking questions. Dad might be asking questions. I'm going to let them ask their questions. They know that if they don't feel good about the whatever procedure, medication, whatever it is that's up for discussion, that they should continue to ask questions until they feel at peace with it. That's one of the things I teach all my clients. There's a lot of stuff you can't undo. And if you can't undo it once you've done it, then you better have real strong peace about doing it in the first place, right? Break your water. You can't unbreak your water. You can't unvaccinate your child. You can't uncircumcise your child, right? So if you don't have peace about it, keep asking questions, keep doing research, keep whatever. But in the moment in the hospital, keep asking questions. And if I still don't feel, I'm listening to the whole conversation, but if I still don't feel that they're being told the whole truth, that they haven't received all the information so they can make informed consent, then I am not going to make eye contact with them until the discussion seems to come to a close. Then I might say to them, there could be some options such as this or such as that. Like, the goal here is this, so we could do a couple of these things as alternatives. And I'm speaking to my client. I'm not asking the doctor permission. Oh, well, is it okay if we go do some curb walking? Oh, will you let her get in the shower? That's not my job. My job isn't to speak for her. So I might say to my client, you know, we could try the shower. We could try some lunges. There's some other things that we could try right now. And then they can then state their wishes, right? But in labor, it's hard to complete sentences sometimes. And so giving your client the words is important. And then also just remembering timing and being really careful with your face and allowing conversations to unfold. We don't have to interject. We might feel like we should, right? But again, that is not our role. Our role is not to interject. Our role is not to interrupt. Our role is not to contradict, right? But when the timing is right for us to speak up, then we can give alternatives. We can explain stats. We can remind your client about things you've already taught them, right? And then our own legal loopholes. We have to be careful that anything we are explaining or recommending to our client as an option, that we know our stuff. So if we're giving advice and it's not evidence-based, right? Like, let's say you give your client advice about something or to explain an option to her, and it's not an evidence-based option. So let's say, for example, baby's not engaging in the pelvis, and you say, all right, well, you know, what we can do is I'll hold your feet and we're going to turn you into a upside down position. You can stand on your head for 5 minutes. I mean, this is a silly example, but you could get in trouble for recommending something like that, because that is not evidence-based. However, you can say to your client anything that, so think of it this way. If you had to defend what you're saying, would you be able to find a study or some kind of mainstream kind of medical advice on this thing, right? If you could find something online or whatever to back you up, go ahead and say it. If you can't, if what you're saying sounds like circus tricks to the staff, you're going to get, you could be, first of all, they're not going to take you seriously as a doula. You now have just pretty much eliminated your position as a team member in this birth. And potentially you could get removed, and that's not good for your client, because you're interfering with care. So knowing what your, just knowing that you can get resources later after the fact if necessary for any kind of, recommendation that you gave. And then the other little legal loophole is, specifically, and Sarah said this about the dad, which I thought was really clever, but your own legal loophole is that even though you can't speak for your client, the partner can. And so sometimes I'll even text dad something and I'll just flash him like that, so he knows I just sent him a text telling him, they're about to do this, or expect this, or ask this question, or whatever. Knowing what their wishes are doesn't mean I have the right to speak their wishes for them, but I can prompt them to speak their wishes for themselves. Okay. So the whole idea behind advocacy for doulas is all about facilitating conversation, right? Facilitating communication, and all about consent. So ensuring consent requires preparation with your client. Guarding consent in the moment means that you're clearly stating whatever she needs to be consenting to, so she understands what's about to happen and that she has the right to say yes or no. Right? Are we all good? Do you have questions? Anyone who has questions, please pop in and ask me a question.
I have a question about prenatals.
Yes.
So obviously these are very important conversations to have in prenatals. Do you have any tips on how to approach this with a client that it's kind of blissfully ignorant themselves and are super excited about their care provider, and maybe the care provider is going to be incredibly respectful throughout the birth, but you wanted them to be prepared to advocate for themselves? How do you kind of balance giving the information about like the reality of the world that we live in while also not scaring them about what their experience is going to be like?
This is a really good and fair question. And I, a lot of times, will allow real life to play out a little bit. So this is her choice. This is her doctor. She loves her doctor. She trusts her doctor. Usually they're going to get the whole talk about, the ARRIVE trial. They're going to get the whole talk about 39-week induction. And I prepare them with that information. And that way, when their doctor starts bringing stuff up, I'm not there to say, I told you so, but it allows them to see a little crack in why maybe their doctor is not working with evidence-based recommendations. And so it just allows them to maybe see a little more like, oh, you know what? They don't have my best interests at heart. They have their own. If you're with a client and to me, I kind of feel like, why are you hiring me if you don't believe anything I say or want to hear anything I say? But okay, I'm there for you. And I've had clients who have straight out told me that they're hiring me because they want to prevent a C-section. And I let them know I'm not a guarantee against a C-section. I might have great C-section rates when it comes to like avoiding C-sections, but that is not my job. And unless we are working together to avoid all the things that lead to a cesarean, right? And unnecessary cesarean at that, then we're really not able, our hands are tied. And so we're not, just by being there, we're not reducing their C-section rate. I know that there is a training organization or two that states that just having a doula in the room reduces C-section rates, but that's not, that, what, how? Did that answer your question, Shannon?
At the end
Oh,
of the day, you might remind them that, you know, this is your body, this is your child, this is your life.
Yeah, I like the Arrive trial as like an entryway into how to navigate those types of conversations.
yeah, because pretty much every single mama is getting that pressure at this point. And to be able to say, you don't have to go along with that, just like you don't have to go along with any recommendation that they give. And one of the things that I say to my clients all the time is I believe in your ability to give birth without any interference, without any intervention. And I trust you, I trust your body, and I trust your baby to be able to navigate that. And that alone, just being able to say to them, I trust you, nobody else is treating her like they trust her, right? Do they trust her enough to poop on her own? Well, then why can't they trust her enough to birth her baby on her own? Right? She doesn't necessarily need all this craziness. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, Mandy was saying that she's going to add teaching consent as part of her framework for her prenatals. Okay. For me and my business as a doula, I actually have it in my contract to where I put on there, I am not your advocate. And that actually sparks the conversation with my client about the difference between me being their advocate and teaching them about informed consent, so on and so forth. So it automatically brings that conversation up. So it's not awkward bringing it up later on. It's the first thing that we really talk about between my clients and myself.
That's good. And one of the things I didn't say when we were talking about the difference between advocate and ambassador is that, you know, a lot of times people think that their job as the doula is more of an ambassadorship, right? You're going to speak for, you're representing the client, you're speaking her wishes for that, for her. But you're not an ambassador. You're not there to speak for them, right? And not only that, an ambassador is there in place of whoever, right? Let's say it's just a political ambassador. The US ambassador is there because the US is over here, right? And so they're speaking for the US while they're there. Your client is in the room. Your client is present. They are able to speak for themselves. But you might have to say, oh, hang on one second. She's just in the middle of a contraction. Let's give her a second. And I've had caregivers who just ignore that and just continue asking. And I'll remind them, I'll say, well, she'll answer you in just a second. Just let her finish this contraction. And they're sometimes just jerks, you know, they don't care and they'll keep asking or whatever. And I just tell my client, there's no rush for you to answer that question. Just focus on what you need to focus on. A lot of times your best work doing advocacy in the room is reminding your client that they have the freedom to say yes, no, take time. Just that they have rights, that they have body autonomy, right? And that they have the right to say yes, say no, to delay, to whatever it is that they need. But a lot of times they don't feel that way. And practitioners coming in with that authoritative attitude, it's a coercive attitude. And it's hard to say no to that when you're in a vulnerable state like labor puts you in. So reminding
I
her
had
that,
one more thing.
yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I had one more thing to add real quick before we go. As doulas, we're going to have family members that are going to ask us to be their doula. Okay. If you have a sister, cousin, niece, whatever, and you're being their doula, you have to remind them, just because I'm family, I'm not your advocate. They have to have someone else there unless you become the medical proxy, whatever. That was a challenge I had at first because my first client starting up with a family member. And so I had to remind myself to bite my tongue when it came to things, because ultimately it's her choice, you know? So that's a big one too, is if you get family members as students or whatever, just remember you are not the advocate for your family unless it is medically or legally documented.
Have any of you here as a grandma been to a birth of one of your daughters giving birth? Anybody here? Kate, Susan, Gail, Sarah, you have daughters that give birth?
My husband's older, so my
Okay.
daughter-in-law was actually my first two births that I attended.
Nice. So I have not done this yet, but I'm looking forward to, my oldest is going to have her baby in the end of July. I'm so excited. But I know ahead of time, that's like that point you made, Sarah, is so powerful, because I've been a doula where, like, you know, the grandma's there and she's trying to tell the doctor to do stuff for her daughter, and the daughter doesn't want, you know, I had one mom that was, or one grandma who was hounding the doctor to give her daughter an epidural. Her daughter did not want an epidural. She wanted to go all natural. And the grandma followed doctor into the hall and was telling him, you have to, it's in pain. You have to, it's your obligation or whatever, professional obligation or whatever, to get her out of pain. And the daughter was just like, can we just get her out of the hospital at this point? Like, can we just dismiss her? Not that I would be that grandma, but I look forward to experiencing that dynamic for myself, because I know that it could potentially be very tricky, because as the mom, you know, you feel like you know what's best for your child. But you gotta respect them and give them the freedom to make the choices for themselves. And honestly, I feel like most of my clients are like daughters to me in a way, because, you know, they're younger and you're mothering them. Like, that's one of the whole roles of being a doula, is you're mothering the new mother, right? So it's definitely tricky sometimes. Anybody else? Any words of wisdom, any examples, questions? Are we good? Oh,
Hi, my name is
hi.
Kyla. I have a question. So I am a new doula, and I am still looking to get my actual certification, and I've been looking into maternity wise. But I wanted to ask, like, are all of you guys' programs offered virtual? Because I'm in Chicago, and so I haven't seen anything that's in person for Chicago.
Well, we don't have anything in person in Chicago right now. Well, we have one on the calendar, but there's no dates for it yet. We're working on setting dates. But yeah, we have actually a workshop coming up in 5 days. Well, 4 days, we're having a virtual live workshop. So it's a workshop that's happening in person in Minneapolis. And then it'll also be broadcast virtually, so you could attend that way if you wanted to. Oh, Natalie's gonna get you the link to that workshop. So that you
Okay, thank you. And that's a certification workshop?
can.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else here maternity wise doulas? Everybody else here, I think. Most everybody.
Yeah, I just started
Yes.
self-program.
Awesome. And would y'all recommend it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it so much so far.
Definitely.
Okay, I just linked the virtual for you.
Yay, thanks, Natalie.
No
So I know that there's a lot of organizations to choose from out there, and I appreciate that you're here with us today, exploring how we see advocacy. And many of you are also trainers for maternity wise. I see a lot of trainer faces here. And so it's really good to, you know, it's good to have all the skills of being a maternity wise doula, because we're super in depth, but it's also just these interpersonal dynamics can be so tricky. And so I want to encourage you guys also that we have our Facebook group. There's always conversations around, you know, how to interact, or, you know, I'm in this sticky situation. Anybody got any tips? You know, so there's a lot of support there. Definitely use the Facebook group for support as needed. You also have access to weekly study groups. Shayla's got those going, and and then also if you ever just, you should have a mentor also. When you sign up for Maternity Wise, you'll get a mentor. But if you are in the moment, like I don't know who else to turn to, but hop on the website, and at the bottom of every page on the website, there is a dialogue box where you can ask a question, and feel free to go ahead and ask a question in there. Natalie, Shayla, or myself, we're usually the ones looking at those that when they come through. So we're here to help, we're here to support and answer. And if you have, if you're in a sticky situation where you're not sure, how do I advocate in this situation? What is that going to look like? We're happy to help, right? And we're happy to kind of walk through all your options, because we feel that as far as us being trainers, we feel that we are doulaing the doulas. And so that's our job. So we're happy to be here to help you guys. And if you have any further questions, please reach out. But it was really lovely to have you all this morning. Thank you so much. Talk to you later. Mwah. Have a great week.